It started out as the Society for Hospital Attorneys, and it resulted from the fact that as General Counsel of the American Hospital Association, I conducted a few educational programs every year, and they were on hospital law. And the people who came were mostly lawyers representing hospitals. And in those days, most of the hospitals were nonprofit, and the lawyers were serving pro bono, so they needed some education quickly. The same people seemed to be coming over and over, and after a while we decided we ought to have an organization of these people. And so I got together with Don Byerly of Yankton, South Dakota, and Carl Holderly of St. Louis, and we agreed that I would pester Dr. Crosby, the head of the American Hospital Association, and they would keep bothering him with letters and phone calls, and tried to get the American Hospital Association to sponsor a hospital lawyers group, because they already had groups of hospital pharmacists, nurse anesthetists, dietitians, and Dr. Crosby didn't want any part of it because he didn't like lawyers. And he said, we have one lawyer and we don't get sued. Our friends down the street, the American Medical Association, they've got half a dozen lawyers and they're getting sued all the time. Well, years went by, and the three of us kept bothering Dr. Crosby, and one day when we opened a brand new office in a brand new building on Farragut Square in Washington, Dr. Crosby came to visit, and the building was new and not in the best of shape yet, and a ceiling tile fell and hit him on the head. And it may have been pure coincidence, but that day he told me, okay, create the organization of lawyers. And so I immediately got the list of all the people who had been going to our educational programs. And then my boss of the Washington office said, you're not going to run this organization. You're not going to spend your time on that. You have to hire somebody to run it. And so I interviewed a number of people, and I chose David Greenberg. In spite of the fact that he was obviously a polio victim, he was able to walk with the various metal work on his legs, and I thought he would stick with the job. The other applicants seemed to be just transitional. And so we got together and we contacted all the people on our list, and before long we had a couple of hundred members, and that meant we got to have a meeting of all these people, and so we arranged to have the first annual meeting at the Palmer House in Chicago. I then left the American Hospital Association and joined Kaiser Permanente just a month or two before that first annual meeting. And so David was on his own, and he really administered the program himself thereafter. And at that first meeting, something like 40% of our membership showed up. So we realized we had a strong affinity, and from that grew a group of people who had the strongest camaraderie, conviviality. They cared about each other, they cared about their families who came to the annual meetings. They didn't care anything about their politics. If there was ever any disagreement on any subject, political or legal, it was always done in a very cordial manner. And we got to see the children growing up. We got to see people divorcing and remarrying. It was just a delightful crowd. And if we had time, I could tell you about some of these remarkable people. We had connections with the Kennedy administration. We had people running for governor. We had the most diverse and admirable people. Of course, you can't keep that up when you have 14,000 members. But within a few years, we had 2,000 or 3,000 members. And of course, I was one of the many people who held office. I held every office they had. There were 8, and so the last one, of course, is past president, and that one you don't lose. So I'm still a past president.
At first, it was called the Hospital Society, and at some point, it became the Academy. When did that happen? That
was many years, 15 years or so. It was when Larry McLeod perhaps was president.
Was there a reason why it changed names?
To distinguish them from, I guess, from the hospital pharmacists and nurse anesthetists, they felt they were more than a society, that they were like the medical academies, the medical professional academies, and so that it was simply an attempt to make the organization sound more academically professional.
What was the mission? How would you describe the mission of the Academy?
It was purely educational officially, and it was extremely successful in doing so. In addition to this 4-day annual meeting at various interesting places around the country and in Canada, there were meetings about 3-4 times a year, also in various places around the country, producing educational content. And we had a group of lecturers that we used both for the annual meeting and for these, I guess you might say, quarterly educational meetings. And when a specific legal topic came up that was worth having a special meeting on, we did that too.
And you had offices in D.C. near Farragut Square, huh?
Originally, yes. But then, of course, the AHA headquarters, which was in Chicago, said all of our other societies are managed in Chicago. The lawyers have to come to Chicago as well. Well, David Greenberg, a polio victim who was able to walk in Washington without crutches or walker or cane, he thought he could not manage winters in Chicago, that snow and sleet were too big of a challenge for him. And so he refused to move to Chicago, and that ended his job. And he said, well, you know, this organization really is too restricted in its membership. It's lawyers who represent or work for hospitals and some of the academics who are in that field. It should be open to anybody, any lawyer, in the health field. And I think I will try to create such an organization if this one isn't going to expand. And so he proceeded to do that.
Mm-hmm. And he created the National Health Lawyers Association.
Yes, he did.
Describe David Greenberg for us. I mean, what kind of a guy was he? It sounds like, talking to some of you folks, that he was kind of a character.
David was different from most people, aside from the fact that he suffered from polio. He was, in a sense, an innocent, and that resulted from the fact that he was afflicted by polio when his family, who are ardent Zionists, moved to Palestine, now known as Israel, just before World War II. And there was an epidemic of polio there at that time, and he was afflicted when he was in his early teens. Well, the war broke out, and they couldn't come back to the States for better care that he needed. But Mrs. Greenberg, being a loyal American, started entertaining American soldiers who were stationed in Palestine and in Egypt so they could get good American meals. And one of the soldiers who came was an officer, a medical officer in the U.S. Army, and he came and he saw David Greenberg completely paralyzed and immobilized, and the doctor was absolutely shocked. And he said, when I get out of this army and go back, I'm going to do my best to work on treating and curing this horrible polio. And so Dr. Albert Sabin went back to the University of Cincinnati Medical School, and he did. He created the live polio vaccine that did wipe out polio throughout the world until very recently. It broke out in a few places. But that was the stimulus of David to eliminating the disease that ruined his life. When David Greenberg got back to the United States after World War II ended, he was indeed treated here and he was fitted with various mechanisms and taught to walk. But they discovered, and he discovered, he had never been to high school. He had not been to school at all in his teens, and now he was about 20 years of age. So an arrangement was made with an academic institution in Milton, Massachusetts, to condense the 4-year high school curriculum down to 1 year. And so he went there, and he spent a year, and he got his high school education, and that allowed him to go on to college and get the rest of his education.
He thought the American Academy of Hospital Lawyers was too limited.
Yes.
Tell me about that. So he started the National Health Lawyers Association.
Right, because he thought that anybody interested in health law ought to be eligible to join this organization and take advantage of the education that it provided. He had some friends who assisted him, and they were successful. Because they existed, the problems that the Academy had with the American Hospital Association meant that there was another organization we might merge with. And that indeed is ultimately what occurred after a number of years of contemplating and meeting with people. And so when the two were organized, that it really gave them a mass market, and that explains this huge membership that exists now as compared with the 2,000 or 3,000 that we had in the society that we thought was quite an achievement.
Tell me about Jack Wood.
Well, Jack Wood was an unusual person. He was tall. He was not very smiley. He was a dedicated lawyer. He liked to do things by the rules. And in the very first meeting that we arranged in Chicago, he sat in the first row, and Don Byerly of Yankton, South Dakota, who was a man who lost the use of his legs when he was 12, and nevertheless became a lawyer and a judge, and helped us create the society. When we started that first meeting in Chicago, Jack Wood immediately got up and asked Don Byerly, "Why are you presiding? Under what authority are you conducting this meeting?" And I went over to Jack Wood and I said, "We're going to have a recess right now. Come on with me." And I took him into the men's bathroom and I said, "Jack, it has taken us many years to get going. Please let us at least get started. We'll have bylaws and all the other things you want very soon." So he sat down quietly. Byerly conducted the meeting. We got going, and Jack ultimately, I guess, became president under the bylaws that we had adopted.
You had, at these annual meetings of the Academy, you had what some people called proms.
Well, there was, the finale always was a dinner dance. And our 4-day annual meeting ended with a very high quality dance. We always had an orchestra and very fine food. And the women, you know, we did have women on the board. We had women lawyers, but most of the members were men, and they had female wives. And the wives were really involved in the social events, culminating in the dinner dance. And they selected the flowers and how things were arranged on the table, even the food. So there was one event, though, that was really quite memorable. The afternoon before the dinner dance was a free afternoon, and people were expected to go out and enjoy the city or the resort that we were at. Well, this particular one was at the Del Coronado in San Diego. And John Devine was, like me, an ex-president, but thought of himself of a fine athlete. And somebody told him that the Del Coronado was not too far from the Mexican border. You could actually swim there. And he thought, well, I'm a macho swimmer, I'll do it. And so he jumped in the water, and he swam a while, and he got caught in either coral or other sharp objects, and he horribly tore up his forehead, lots of bleeding, and he had to be sewn up at the emergency room. And he came back with his head completely wrapped in a white bandage. He looked like a Sikh. Well, he met me and found me in a wheelchair and with a big white cast on my foot. What happened to me? Well, I had agreed to play tennis, even though I'd broken something in my knee 10 years before and wasn't able to play, but I thought after 10 years, I think I can do it. So I played, and after 10 minutes, I pulled a ligament in my ankle and couldn't walk. Went to the emergency room, got into a soft cast, which meant I couldn't walk, had to be in the wheelchair. So I had to go to the dinner dance in the wheelchair with my cast showing. John Devine saw me and said, you know, I can still walk, I can push you. So he pushed me in there, and you had 1,000 people rolling on the floor with laughter. This is what happens to past presidents of this organization. And I wish I had a picture to show you because it is hysterically funny.
Women were active. Now, you said it was mostly men, but women were active, especially for that time, professionally as healthcare lawyers. Tell me why do you think that took place? Why women were able to have such prominent roles?
The women who had prominent roles in the society and the academy were prominent women. Kay Felt of Detroit was a hospital attorney, probably the best known, the best and most accomplished in Detroit. But she did have one failure. She never was able to convince us to have an annual meeting in Detroit, even though she would show us movies of what a great place it is. And the other woman who was on the board for many years was Sister Celestine. She was a nun, and she was a lawyer, and she represented the Sisters of Charity, which had a chain of hospitals. And of course, she didn't go to the dance, but she came to all of our events and was very well received. She liked everybody. And when she retired, she invited 3 of us to her retirement home for retired nuns and priests just off the Gettysburg battlefield. And so we enjoyed both the battlefields and visiting with Sister Celestine.
When you ran the San Francisco meeting, someplace around 1980, you said, the earth shook.
It certainly did. You know, most of the people who came to that San Francisco annual meeting, which I was conducting as president-elect, had never experienced an earthquake. And we had 2 days in a row. By San Francisco standards, they were really quite mild and didn't scare the locals much. But for the people sitting there at our annual meeting and watching chandeliers wave like pendulum, they were beginning to get up and start rushing out. But you know, an earthquake takes only a few seconds, and they calmed down, and we went on.
What would you describe as the big milestones in healthcare law during your career?
Well, I missed out on the biggest, and that was the Affordable Care Act. Was adopted long after I retired. I guess Medicare was the most important thing in my era, and I think maybe I arranged to adopt a few words into that act. I'm not sure. But Medicare got the government's foot in the door towards national health insurance. And we had, as a matter of fact, the San Francisco program that I ran was dedicated to national health insurance. And that was because Jimmy Carter, who was president at the time, was working on such a plan. And he had a young doctor doing this on his staff. And so I invited that young doctor to address our annual meeting. And he agreed, and he came and he told what they were going to do. And while we never compensated any of our speakers, we always gave them a gift. And at that time, I had just been in Hong Kong and discovered I could buy digital watches, which were brand new and were a hot item. Now you can get them for $1.50. But I was able to get a couple of dozen of them to compensate our speakers for a mere $14 each. And we gave them to everybody. And I sent one to the doctor at the White House, and he sent it back. And he said, it's unethical for us folks at the White House to keep this gift, and we also refuse to be compensated for our travel expenses. I wonder if those are still the rules in the White House.
Looking back, tell me how different health law was when you began compared to the way it is now.
Well, I had mentioned that most of the hospitals were nonprofit. If they had lawyers, they often didn't have to pay them. And a lot of them didn't even carry malpractice insurance. And I remembered asking Sister Celestine why they take that chance. And she said, well, we know that God will protect us. I think they have learned differently since. So it was a simple kind of specialty, and there were only one or two books on the subject at that time. When we started our annual meetings, the speakers would produce written materials about the subject they were talking about. And they began producing inch-thick materials for us. And so we had to have a tote bag for people to carry them home. As years went by, the material stack got larger. And as I recall, the last time I went to a convention, I had to carry 4 tote bags home with me. Here we have one of the tote bags, and as you can see, it says American Society for Hospital Attorneys of the American Hospital Association. We dropped that American Hospital Association after a while, and we also didn't give any money to the officers, but when they finally retired, as I did, I got a paperweight, and it says, in appreciation for dedicated services to the Board of Directors of the American Society of Hospital Attorneys, Arthur H. Bernstein, June 1974 through June 1982. So 8 years on the board.
You mentioned that romance is sometimes developed.
Oh, yes. As I may have mentioned, we got to know all the spouses and some of the children, and we also got to know who wasn't getting along with whom. And there were indeed divorces, and then there were new spouses that came on. And there were people who actually met and married. Our Canadian member, Lauren Rozovsky, met a young woman hospital attorney, American, at our meeting in Tampa. And she was in the process of getting a divorce. And so the timing was right, and they got together, they married, they had children, and they remained in the health law field. Oh, I might mention that when we started the meeting in Montreal, that being in Quebec, where the rules are, all meetings have to start in French. And I, as president at the time had to start the meeting in French. Well, I had 1 year of high school French, and I thought I could put together the opening sentences. I consulted with Lauren Rosowski, who as a Canadian was bilingual, and so we started that meeting in French, and then I immediately turned it over to him to complete the legal requirements in Quebec of doing it in French, and then we got rid of that obligation and conducted the rest of the meeting in English.
What's your advice for young attorneys?
That's a hard thing for me to say. I didn't really have a very successful career, and so I'm not going to suggest that anybody follow what I did. I worked for 3 nonprofit organizations in the health field, all of whom paid very low. And so the people that I dealt with in this organization, partners in big law firms all around the country, and they were out of my league financially. Right now is probably a good time to be in the health law field because we are going to have all sorts of problems with whatever comes out of Congress in this term. And there'll be a lot of contractual problems as well. But it won't be what it was in the very early days when it was a unique kind of law, because it really isn't anymore. It's just a form of business law about the health law business. But I'm hardly the one to give advice on how to succeed in this field.
It sounds like the early days, it was a much more innocent time. You say the lawyers, a lot of their work was pro bono. I guess that's because they were on the boards of these nonprofit hospitals and that kind of thing. Expand on that for us a little bit.
Yes, it was a public duty. The Catholic hospitals got Catholic lawyers to do pro bono work. And the community hospitals had lots of volunteers. And the government-owned hospitals, of course, had government lawyers. So it was hardly like it is now, where most of the lawyers are from law firms and are charging the usual fees.
On this 50th anniversary, how would you characterize or describe the history of this American Health Lawyers Association?
Well, I suppose you can say only in America. It probably has occurred with other fields. I think that there was something unusual. I would guess that if you had a group of lawyers from the hardware business, it's unlikely that they would have gotten so chummy with each other and with their families and would look forward to meeting with them every year and entertaining each other. I rather doubt that. There was something special, and that was in part because a lot of them were doing this as a charitable contribution. So they were dealing with other people who were not just in it for the money.
Finally, what do you see as the future of health law and the AHLA?
It's so large now, it's hard to believe it could even grow larger. But it's obviously the prime source of information about health law. If you want to be educated in that field, you join that organization and you go to their educational meetings. Also now, if you want a job, they've got an employment service. It's really doing things that we didn't anticipate in the early days. So it's an all-purpose organization in the field.
All right, that's all I have, but if you have anything you'd like to add, I'd love to hear it.
I can certainly tell you about the John Devine and Marnie Kennedy story.
Yeah, tell us that.
When I was still with the American Hospital Association, I was asked if I would talk to a lawyer from Ann Arbor, Michigan, who had just become the lawyer for the local hospital and knew nothing about hospital law. And he wanted me to inform him. So John Devine came, and we spent a lot of time, and I told him whatever I knew, and he was very, very grateful. Well, soon thereafter we created the society, and of course he immediately joined. And when the social events became a part of the program, his wife participated. Well, his wife was Marnie Kennedy. She was the daughter of the brother of Ambassador Joseph Kennedy. She grew up in Boston, and she grew up with all of her cousins, Jack, Bobby, Ted, and all the girls. She looked exactly like the Kennedy girls, and she sounded like them. And she sure knew about how to create dinners and other social events. John was a Republican, and he married into the Kennedys, and he remained a Republican, as far as I know, for the rest of his life. And he nevertheless was close to the Kennedys. And I asked him once, when Ted Kennedy was contemplating running for president, I asked him, John, do you think your cousin Teddy is really going to run? And John said, I sure hope not. Oh, really? Why not? I can't stand to go to another one of those funerals. And that ended a conversation ever on that subject.